Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series with Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre III. Now this of course is the third film in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. Now, shortly after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre II, New Line Cinema, who became famous for the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, acquired the rights to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, and they actually made this movie with the intent on kickstarting a whole new series of Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, and they wanted this new series of Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies to kind of replace the Nightmare on Elm Street series, which was winding down at this point. And they wanted to make Leatherface essentially like the next Freddy Krueger or Jason. Now, originally, Peter Jackson, who at this point had directed Bad Taste and Meet the Feebles, he was actually originally going to write and direct this movie, and I think he even wrote a draft for this movie. Now, Peter Jackson, of course, would go on to direct films like Dead Alive and Heavenly Creatures and The Frighteners, and of course the Lord of the Rings movies. And I'm not gonna lie, I would have loved to have seen what Peter Jackson would have done with this movie. Something tells me, though, that if Peter Jackson were to direct this movie, it would probably be very much in the same vein as something like Bad Taste, which was a very over-the-top horror comedy. But for one reason or another, Peter Jackson didn't end up directing this movie, so the directing job went to Jeff Burr. Now, before this, Jeff Burr directed the movie From a Whisper to a Scream with Vincent Price, and he also directed The Stepfather 2, and after this, he would go on to direct movies like Pumpkinhead 2, Blood Wings, and Puppet Master 4 and Puppet Master 5. Now, the movie is written by David Schow, who I believe is actually an author, and he also did an uncredited rewrite for A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, and he also would go on to co-write The Crow, as well as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, and he also wrote a few episodes of the TV series Masters of Horror, and he also wrote the film The Hills Run Red. And he also wrote Critters 3 and 4. Now, there are actually several different versions of this movie. Now, this DVD comes with two versions of the movie, the R-rated version and the unrated version. Now, the unrated version is the version of the movie that I recently watched, so I could do this review. Now, I saw the R-rated version of this movie a long time ago on TV, and I remember I didn't really care for it too much, but that's probably because the R-rated cut... Now, granted, I haven't seen the R-rated cut for a while, but I remember the R-rated cut really didn't make a lot of sense, because the R-rated cut had a lot of scenes that were cut out of the film. The unrated cut of the film has a lot of the scenes that were originally taken out put back in, so the unrated cut of this film is a little more coherent. So if you get this DVD, I personally recommend watching the unrated cut of the film. Now, I thought Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre III, was a pretty good movie if you watch the unrated version. However, it's nowhere near as good as the first two movies, in my opinion. Now, originally, I believe Jeff Burr intended this movie to be a lot more ambitious than it actually ended up being, and a lot of this movie's problems really aren't Jeff Burr's fault. Apparently, from everything that I heard, apparently New Line Cinema was really up his ass during the making of this movie. Like, one of this movie's biggest problems is the ending, and the ending is not Jeff Burr's fault at all. Apparently, Jeff Burr didn't even know about the ending of this movie because they shot that ending without him even knowing about it. But this movie has a really ridiculous ending where a character who you clearly saw die in this movie all of a sudden out of nowhere is miraculously alive at the end, and it's really ridiculous. But apparently the original ending of this movie was completely different, but New Line Cinema, they didn't like the original ending, so without Jeff Burr even knowing about it, they shot a different ending. Like, it's a flawed movie, but I think a lot of the flaws that this movie has aren't necessarily the fault of the director or the writer of this movie. Now, the plot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre III is it follows this couple named Michelle and Ryan who are traveling through Texas, and at a certain point in the movie, they end up at this gas station, and they meet this character named Tex, who tells them about this route that they should take, which would lead them to this town. They end up taking the route, and what ends up happening is they end up getting attacked by somebody in a truck, and basically it turns out that they run into the family, the Sawyers, and they run into Leatherface, and they also meet this survivalist named Benny, played by Ken Foree, who is like one of those people who's always preparing for the end of the world, and they run into him, and he becomes caught up in all this, and he's now trying to help them, fight back against Leatherface and the rest of the Sawyer family. And it turns out that that character, Tex, who showed them that route, is actually a member of the family. And that's the basic plot line of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre III. Now, in the film, Kate Hodge plays the character of Michelle, and she does a really good job in the film, and William Butler plays her boyfriend, Ryan. Now, William Butler was also in Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, where he played the character of Michael, and he was also in the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, where he played Tom. And William Butler has actually gone on to become a writer and director. And the film, as I said, stars Ken Foree as the character of Benny, who is a really awesome character, and I love Ken Foree. Ken Foree's a great actor. Of course, most people would know him as Peter from Dawn of the Dead, and he also played Keithan's dad in Keithan and Kel. But Ken Foree's a great actor, and he does a really good job in this film. And Viggo Mortensen plays the character of Tex. Now, Viggo Mortensen, of course, would go on to become a huge, big A-list actor, but I think this was his first movie. I'm actually not sure if this was his first movie or not, but this was definitely one of his earlier roles, and this was before he became as famous as he is now, but he does a really good job in this film as well. Now, Leatherface in this movie is played by an actor named R.A. Mihailoff. However, Kane Hodder, who also played Jason in several of the Friday the 13th movies, actually did some of the stunt work for this movie, and there are actually certain shots of Leatherface in this movie where it is Kane Hodder playing him. But once again, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre III is a pretty good movie. Really, a lot of the problems that this movie has are really editing problems, because there are several different versions of this movie, and the version to watch really is the unrated version. However, the unrated version still has that ridiculous ending that New Line Cinema tacked on to the movie. Now, despite this movie's problems, there is actually actually a lot to like about this movie. Like, there's a lot of really creepy aspects of this film. For example, there's this little girl in the family who is actually implied to be Leatherface's daughter, and I believe this scene is only in the unrated cut of the movie, but there's actually a scene in the unrated cut of this movie where this little girl kills somebody while the whole family is watching, and Leatherface is watching her really the same way a father would watch his daughter learn how to ride a bike or something. It's really disturbing, and after she kills this guy, Leatherface then hugs her and gives her a kiss, and it's really disturbing when you just stop to think about it, because she just killed somebody. Now, I do want to point out that at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre II, it actually looked as if Leatherface died at the end of that movie, so it almost seems like this movie is ignoring the continuity of Part 2. However, in this movie, you see Leatherface walking around with a leg brace, and apparently 2 is still in continuity. Apparently, you're supposed to assume that Leatherface somehow survived after apparently being killed in Part 2. And also, Caroline Williams, who played the main character in the previous film, she has a brief cameo appearance in this movie as a reporter, and apparently it is supposed to be the same character. But yeah, depending on which version of the film you watch, Leatherface the Texas Chainsaw Massacre III is a pretty good movie. Now, as I said, New Line Cinema made this movie with the intent on kickstarting a whole new series of Texas Chainsaw Massacre films, but this film was not the success that New Line Cinema was hoping it would be, so even though there were Texas Chainsaw Massacre films after this, it wasn't the same thing that New Line Cinema was hoping for. But yeah, that's my review on Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, and bye.